It was August of 2019. I remember because it was the first time I questioned reality itself. Kelly and I had been planning the RV trip for months. City life had worn us thin, and the idea of disappearing into the barren quiet of the Oklahoma Panhandle seemed like the reset we both needed. Just us, open skies, and miles of nothing. I wanted nothing more than silence. Be careful what you wish for. The RV park was little more than a gravel lot off Highway 412. A few other rigs were parked at a distance, their lights flickering in the gathering dusk. We didn't talk much that evening. I remember how the air felt. It hung heavy, too thick for a summer breeze. It wasn't the warmth that made me sweat. It was that feeling, you know? When something's watching. Just out of sight, Kelly was inside making dinner, humming some old tune, but I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. I chalked it up to being tired and stepped back inside, locking the RV door behind me. As if that lock would have done anything. By the time the storm alert came through my phone, I could barely hear the rain outside. Tornado warning. Kelly glanced over my shoulder, reading the message with me. We need to move. Now. Her voice was sharp, pressing, but I just stood there, staring at the screen. I couldn't explain it, but something in me, something primal, said not to run. The map showed the storm was barreling straight for us, a crimson blotch devouring everything in its path. I could hear the wind screaming now, rocking the RV in uneven jerks. Kelly was throwing things into bags, ready to bolt, but I couldn't move. "Ethan, let's go!" she shouted. And then it stopped. The wind, the rain, everything. One second the world was tearing itself apart. The next, nothing. No breeze. No rattle of rain against the windows. Kelly froze, half-zipped duffel bag in hand, staring at the sudden stillness. The only sound left was the soft hum of our refrigerator. I don't know how long we stood there. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. The sky outside was dark, but not with clouds. It was empty, blank. No stars, no moon. Just blackness pressing against the glass. I stepped outside. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd see the tornado in the distance, or feel the pressure drop. Instead, I found something far worse. A mile away, where the RV park's office should have been, there was nothing but torn earth. Like something had reached down and scooped the land clean. I could see the trail, a narrow path of destruction cutting clean through the horizon, yet our RV sat untouched, like a toy forgotten by a careless child. Kelly stepped out behind me, clinging to my arm. I felt her trembling, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The lights from the other RVs were gone. The rigs were still there, but the people were missing. There were no signs of struggle. Doors hung open, camping chairs sat around extinguished fire pits. Everything looked left behind. A low, groaning noise echoed from somewhere distant. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded like something dragging across gravel, slow and deliberate. I turned to Kelly, ready to tell her we needed to leave. But the words died in my throat. She was staring past me, her face pale as bone. "There's someone standing by the fence," she whispered. I didn't want to look. I had to. Across the empty lot, by the rusted chain-link fence marking the edge of the property, stood a figure. Tall. Still. I could make out no features, just a silhouette darker than the night behind it. It didn't move. It didn't sway with the wind, because there was no wind. I grabbed Kelly's hand and pulled her inside. We locked the doors. I pulled the blinds, but the feeling didn't leave. It grew. Kelly sat by the window, peeking out through the crack between the blinds. She didn't say anything for a long time, neither did I, until she asked the question that still haunts me. "Ethan, when did the lights turn back on?" I looked around. The other RVs, dark minutes ago, were glowing softly, but not with the warm yellow of interior lamps. It was blue, faint and cold, like the glow of a television screen in an empty room. We didn't sleep that night. I don't think we ever saw the sun rise. By morning, the RV park looked normal again. The people returned, friendly and cheerful, as if they had been there all along. When I asked the park manager about the storm, he gave me a strange look and said there hadn't been any tornadoes in the area. No storms, no warnings. I showed him the alert on my phone, but the message was gone. Kelly refused to talk about it after that day. I never found out what I saw, or what saw me. But sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I swear I still hear that dragging sound in the distance. Yellowstone National Park holds a strange kind of quiet at night. The kind that presses down on you until your heartbeat feels like the loudest thing for miles. I should have known better. I had heard stories, seen the viral threads about strange encounters in national parks. But nothing prepares you for it when it happens to you. June of 2023 was when I took the RV out to Yellowstone. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted solitude. Just me, the open road, and the trees. I'm not the kind of guy who does well in crowds. The RV was my escape pod, a cocoon I could take into the wilderness where no one could reach me. Yellowstone seemed perfect. Vast, isolated, and humbling in the way only nature can be. I pulled into the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, slanting through the trees, and the ground shimmered with the heat left over from the day. I chose a spot right at the edge of the campground, where the forest bled into open space. I liked the view. Nothing but pines and distant mountains, a small stream barely visible through the brush. There were other campers, but not many. Most people seemed to stick closer to the center of the site. I wanted to be on the outskirts. Alone, setting up the RV was routine. I unfolded my chair by the fire pit and started stacking logs. As the sun dipped lower, the other campers' fires began to pop up like scattered stars across the field. Their laughter and conversations drifted faintly on the wind. A reminder that, even in isolation, people still lingered nearby. It felt comforting at first. I had been staring at the flames for an hour when I saw him. Across the clearing, maybe 70 yards away, just beyond the last RV, there was another fire. The camper sat in one of those collapsible chairs, the kind that sink when you sit down. His fire was smaller than mine, barely aglow. I could barely see him. Just a silhouette hunched forward slightly, arms resting on his knees, his face hidden. I remember feeling strange about it right away. Something was off. The others at the campground laughed, cooked, and moved around. But he didn't. He just sat there. No movement. No adjusting the fire. Not even a flick of his head toward the night sky. I tried to ignore it. I reasoned that maybe he was lost in thought, maybe reflecting on life. But the longer I watched, the heavier the air seemed to grow. It wasn't until my fire started to burn down that I realized he was still there. Same position. Same exact stillness. I kept glancing over as I doused my flames and retreated inside the RV. The blinds came down fast, and I locked the door behind me. But sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, in the cramped bed, listening to the faint crackle of his fire through the window. At some point, I must have drifted off. I woke up suddenly at 2:13 a.m. I know because I checked the clock the second I opened my eyes. The RV was colder than it should have been. I shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around me. But something felt wrong. You know that primal feeling? That sense of being watched? It hit me hard. I lay there, holding my breath, listening to the kind of silence that feels too thick. And then I heard it. Tap. 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 3 soft knocks on the side of the RV. I didn't move. My body locked up completely. My mind tried to rationalize it. Wind. A branch. But deep down, I knew better. The knocks came again. Slower this time. Tap. 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 I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, knife in hand, and tiptoed to the small window by the door. I hesitated. I didn't want to look. But curiosity pulled me forward. I pressed my fingers against the blinds and lifted them just enough to peer through the gap. The fire across the clearing was gone, but he wasn't. He stood right outside my RV, maybe 15 feet away, partially obscured by shadows. I couldn't see his face, only the shape of his head, tilted slightly, like he was listening. I dropped the blinds instantly and stepped back. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. I gripped the knife, standing there in the dark, sweat trickling down my spine. I must have stood there for over an hour, not moving, not breathing, until finally exhaustion took over, and I slid back into bed without turning my back to the door. Morning came slow. I stepped outside, coffee trembling in my hand, trying to shake the icy weight from my chest. The campground felt different in daylight. Peaceful, almost. I forced myself to walk toward where his fire had been. Nothing. No ashes. No footprints. Just undisturbed dirt and pine needles. But there was something else. Resting on the seat of his empty chair was a photograph. I picked it up with shaking fingers. The edges were curled, weathered by time. In the center was an old RV, identical to mine, parked right where I had set up the night before. And standing next to it was a figure, a man, hunched forward slightly, arms on his knees, staring straight into the camera. I left that afternoon. I didn't pack carefully, didn't even clean the fire pit. I drove until Yellowstone was behind me, and I haven't been back since. Sometimes, though, late at night, I hear soft taps on my bedroom window. I never check. Some things are better left unseen. It was May 2021 when I decided to camp by Lake Mead. I don't know what drew me there, not really. Maybe it was the vague memory of a childhood trip, the image of the water shimmering in the desert heat, or the way it felt like the kind of place where the world couldn't touch you. But what I do know is that I wish I'd never gone. The RV rattled and groaned as I maneuvered it down the dirt path leading to the lake. The landscape around me was barren, almost hostile. Scraggly bushes and jagged rocks dotted the terrain, and the air felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just the heat. It was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. Like a shadow looming just outside your peripheral vision. By the time I reached the lakeshore, the sun was already sinking behind the horizon, its red-orange light spilling across the water. The lake stretched out before me, impossibly vast, its surface unnaturally still. It wasn't peaceful. It was dead. The moment I stepped out of the RV, the silence hit me. Not the kind of quiet you would expect in a remote place, where you might hear the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of wind through the trees. No. This was a silence that pressed against you, that seemed to suck the sound out of the world. Even my own footsteps felt muffled as I walked to the water's edge. I stood there for a while, staring out at the lake. There wasn't a soul in sight. Not a single boat, no other campers, nothing. It didn't make sense. Lake Mead was supposed to be a popular spot, wasn't it? The thought flickered through my mind, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just an off-season thing, I told myself. It was as I was heading back to the RV to set up camp that I saw him. A man, standing on the far side of the clearing, just where the dirt path disappeared into the shadows. He wore a tattered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, the kind fishermen might wear to shield themselves from the sun. But his face was what caught my attention. Or rather, the lack of it. The light was fading fast, and his features were obscured, like they were wrapped in shadow. But his eyes seemed to gleam unnaturally, reflecting the dim light in a way that wasn't right. "Evenin'," he called out, his voice carrying across the clearing like a whisper that somehow felt louder than it should. I froze, a primal unease washing over me. I hadn't heard him approach. There was no crunch of gravel, no rustle of movement. He was just there. "Evening," I replied, forcing my voice to sound casual, though my throat felt dry. "You camping out here?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah," I said. "Just for the weekend?" He nodded slowly, his head bobbing like it was on a loose hinge. "You fish?" "Sometimes," I said. He pointed a long, bony finger toward the water. "Good spot just past the bend there. Big ones." There was something off about the way he said it, like he was reciting lines in a play he didn't fully understand. I nodded, muttered a quick thanks, and turned back toward the RV. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was gone. Despite the unease gnawing at me, I decided to check out the spot he mentioned. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the kind of curiosity that gets you killed in bad horror movies. Either way, I grabbed my gear and followed the shoreline toward the bend he'd pointed to. The path was narrow and uneven, the kind of trail that feels like it's been forgotten by time. The further I went, the darker it got. the moonlight barely piercing through the thickening shadows. When I finally reached the spot, I saw what he meant. The water here was deeper, darker, its surface like polished obsidian. I cast my line and waited, the silence around me feeling heavier with each passing minute. That's when I heard it. A faint splash, like something breaking the surface of the water. I squinted, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then, movement. A ripple, subtle but deliberate, cutting through the still water. And then, I saw him, the fisherman. He was out there, standing waist-deep in the water, his wide-brimmed hat unmistakable. His head was tilted back, as if he were looking up at the sky, but there was something wrong with his posture. His shoulders were rigid, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "You all right?" He didn't respond. I took a step closer, my boots sinking into the soft mud. "Hey!" I shouted again. And then he turned. But it wasn't a normal turn. His body twisted in a way that made my stomach look right. Like his spine was bending in directions it shouldn't. His head snapped toward me, and even from that distance I could see his eyes. They weren't reflecting the moonlight anymore. They were glowing. I don't remember running back to the RV. It's all a blur. Branches clawing at my arms, the ground slipping beneath my feet, the sound of my own ragged breathing drowning out everything else. When I finally slammed the door shut behind me, I locked it and collapsed against it, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence had returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I peered out the window, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of him. The clearing was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind against the metal shell, set my nerves on edge. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I mustered the courage to look, there was nothing there. The next morning, I drove into the nearest town, desperate to shake the unease that clung to me. I stopped at a small diner, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. Over a cup of bitter coffee, I mentioned the fisherman to the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. Her face paled. "Lake Mead's been closed for months," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, closed?" I asked. "Since the accident," she said. "A boat capsized out there last year. They never found the guy who went missing. Fisherman named Paul wore a wide-brimmed hat, always fished the same spot near the bend." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What happened to him?" She shrugged, her expression grim. "Some say he drowned. Others say he's still out there, looking for someone to take his place." I didn't finish my coffee. I didn't even say goodbye. I just left. The image of the fisherman burned into my mind. I haven't been back to Lake Mead since. I sold the RV, moved to a different state, and tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about the lake. In my dreams, I am back at the water's edge, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. And in the distance, I see him, standing waist-deep in the water, his glowing eyes locked onto mine. And then, I wake up, drenched in sweat, the sound of his voice echoing in my ears. "Good spot past the bend there. Big ones." And I know, deep down, that one day, I will hear that voice again. But next time, I won't wake up. Some nights, when the world is quiet and the shadows seem to stretch a little longer than they should, I hear his voice soft, close, like he's standing right behind me. "I know what you did, Lucas. I know everything. It has been 8 years, and I still wake up drenched in sweat, my throat raw from screaming. I don't know if what I saw was real, but I know it was something I was never supposed to encounter. You can tell yourself all you want that ghosts aren't real, that people who vanish into thin air are nothing but stories to scare kids. But if you've been with me on that dark stretch of road near Pismo Beach in September 2016, you wouldn't be so sure. Let me take you back to that night exactly as I remember it. My family and I had been driving up the California coast for days. The RV rattled and groaned with every mile, the engine making a sound like it didn't want to be there any more than I did. It was supposed to be a peaceful, twistle trip. Jenna, my wife, thought it would be good for us. A chance to recharge, she had said. And Adam, Our 8-year-old son loved the idea of sleeping in a house on wheels. Me? I just went along with it. The trouble started late, around midnight. We had parked the RV on a quiet pull-off a few miles outside of Pismo Beach. It was one of those lonely stretches of road, with cliffs on one side and black ocean on the other. The kind of place where headlights only find emptiness when they cut through the dark. I had stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, leaving Jenna and Adam asleep inside. The wind was colder than it should have been for September. It carried the sharp scent of salt and something else I couldn't place. Something metallic, like rusted iron. As I stood there, staring out into the inky black of the ocean, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. A rhythmic crunch of gravel under boots. I froze, my cigarette hanging from my lips. I hadn't heard a car pull up, and there was no one else around for miles. But the footsteps kept coming. I turned around, expecting to see some late-night traveler, maybe another camper. Instead, I saw him. The hitchhiker. He was standing a few feet away, silhouetted against the RV's dim yellow light. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see enough. He was tall, lanky, and his clothes hung off him like they didn't quite fit. A tattered gray hoodie, ripped jeans, and boots that looked like they'd walked through hell and back. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his posture oddly still, like he was trying not to scare me. "You got a light?" he asked. His voice was low, rough, like he hadn't used it in years. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the creeping unease crawling up my spine. Yeah, sure. My hands were trembling as I pulled out my lighter and flicked the flame to life. The hitchhiker stepped closer, just enough for me to see his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, like he hadn't seen sunlight in months. His eyes. God. His eyes were what I remember most. They were too wide, too bright, and the irises seemed to shimmer in the light, like oil floating on water. He grinned a slow, unnatural smile that didn't reach those shimmering eyes. "Thanks, Lucas." I froze. My heart stopped mid-beat. "How do you know my name?" He just stared at me, unblinking. That horrible grin still stretched across his face. I took a step back, my mind racing. Maybe he had seen the RV. Maybe Jenna or Adam had mentioned my name earlier. That made sense, didn't it? But deep down, I knew there was no way. Jenna and Adam had been asleep for hours. "It's a nice family you've got in there," he said, nodding towards the RV. "Jenna and Adam, right?" I dropped the cigarette, my pulse thundering in my ears. I could feel the blood drain from my face. "Who the hell are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his boots grinding against the gravel. The wind picked up, whistling through the cliffs, but I swear it sounded like whispering low voices carried on the air, speaking words I couldn't understand. I stumbled back toward the RV, fumbling for the door handle. I wanted to run, to slam the door in his face and pretend I hadn't just spoken to something that shouldn't exist. But when I looked up, he was gone. Vanished. There was no sound, no footsteps, no movement. Just the empty stretch of road and the wind screaming through the dark. I climbed back into the RV and locked the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely twist the deadbolt. I stood there in the dark for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. The wind howled outside, and the RV creaked in response. I turned to check on Jenna and Adam, half expecting to see that hitchhiker standing over them, but they were still sound asleep. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the driver's seat with my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of movement. Morning came slowly, the sun creeping over the horizon like it didn't want to be there either. I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. That maybe I'd been too tired, or maybe the darkness had played tricks on me. We packed up and hit the road early. Jenna was in good spirits, humming along to some song on the radio, and Adam sat in the back, flipping through a comic book. I kept my eyes on the road, my fingers white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Every so often, I would glance at the side mirrors, half expecting to see that pale face grinning back at me. And then I saw him. We were halfway to Monterey, driving through a long stretch of empty highway, when I caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A figure standing by the side of the road, his thumb stuck out in that universal hitchhiking gesture. It was him, the same gray hoodie, the same two wide eyes. "Lucas!" Jenna's voice made me jump. I glanced over at her, trying to hide the terror on my face. "Yeah? Did you see that guy back there?" My mouth went dry. I nodded. "Yeah, I saw him. He looked weird, didn't he? I didn't answer. I didn't answer. I couldn't. We drove on in silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching us. That night, we stopped at a crowded RV park near Monterey, surrounded by families and laughter. It should have felt safe. It didn't. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, like fingernails against glass. I sat up, my heart pounding. The RV was dark, Jenna and Adam still fast asleep. I listened, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I turned my head slowly, the air feeling thick and heavy, like I was moving underwater. He was there. The hitchhiker stood just outside the window, his face inches from the glass. His skin was paler than before, almost translucent, and his grin was wider. Too wide. His teeth were sharp and gleaming, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. I told you, Lucas. I know everything. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring into those impossible eyes as the tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. And then he was gone. The next morning, I told Jenna we were cutting the trip short. I made up some excuse about work, but I think she could tell something was wrong. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there, to put as many miles as possible between us and whatever that thing was. We made it back home in 2 days. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, I found a photograph tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. It was a picture of the RV. Our RV parked on that lonely pull-off near Pismo Beach. In the corner of the photo, you could see a figure standing in the shadows. The hitchhiker. That was 8 years ago. I moved my family to a different state. I changed my job, my routines, everything I could think of to shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. But every so often, I catch a glimpse of something. A figure by the side of the road, or a shadow where there shouldn't be one. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. And I know he's still watching.